Hello, everyone. So, after our week of reading Manto, Professor Ayesha Jalal has been kind enough to join us today to give us further insight into Manto's social and political views. Professor Ayesha Jalal is the Mary Richardson Professor of History at Tufts University, and she teaches at the Tufts History Department as well as the Fletcher School. She's an author of several books, and today our discussion will revolve around her book on the Pity of Partition, Manto's life, times, and work across the India partition divide. She's joining us today to discuss Manto's social and political views, how they resonate with present day Kashmir, and how he could foresee what India and Pakistan have become today. So, without any ado, I invite Professor Ayesha Jalal to take the mic and lead this discussion, after which we'll have a brief question answer session based on the questions that have been sent in by the audience. Professor, please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be able to do this. Talking about Kashmir and Manto are very dear to my heart, and putting them together makes it an almost irresistible subject for me to spend some time talking. Manto, I think, identified with Kashmir. I mean, he was a Kashmiri, and I think that a lot of you are from the valley and perhaps don't understand that they are Kashmiris who still identify themselves as Kashmiri, even if they've lived in Punjab from day one to the last moment. So I do think that there's a transportable nature to Kashmiri identity, and we shouldn't just assume that only those who are in the valley are affected or are concerned about Kashmir. So I think Manto is one of them. I mean, having grown up in a Kashmiri household myself, I can tell you that we never cease to hear about the usual comment is that Kashmiriyon ki ek hi nani hoti hai. I mean, this we've heard, ever since the day I was born. I think I've been hearing about this. And then, of course, the food and the whole culture. So I think he grew up in a similar context. Of course, he was from from Amritsar. I mean, he was born in Amritsar, grew up there, and his father was a Kashmiri. And they were all a Kashmiri clan, and so the food and all of that, I think the whole atmosphere is so Kashmiri that he identifies himself as Kashmir. But with reference to his work, I think that some of you will be familiar with not just his very amusing letter to Nehru, which I'll come back to later, but also some other. I mean, for instance, when he went to Aligarh. Briefly, he got ill and they suspected tuberculosis or whatever, and so they sent him to Batot. He never made it to the valley. I mean, that's the sad part, because his finances never permitted that. He was always in straitened circumstances. So he went to Batot, and there he supposedly fell in love, so the myth goes, with some young Kashmiri village girl. And he wrote a series of short stories, for instance, Laltain, Misri Ki Dali, Vigo was about that girl. And then he also wrote something called Ek Khat, in which he disabused those who thought that he had spent his time violating the honor of this poor Kashmiri village girl. So that's a very interesting letter. So he has a series of pieces in which he talks about Kashmir. So I think that the link was very strong in his mind, and that brief time that he spent there only added to it. I think one of his regrets was that he never made it to the valley. I think that remained with him for the rest of his life. So now coming to the letter, which I think is very revealing of what he thought of the conflict, since there is a lot of interest in the Indo-Pak situation and Kashmir. I think what he really was conveying is a sentiment that we all have. I mean, that this Indo-Pakistan dispute has completely effaced the people of Kashmir. This is really a real estate dispute between India and Pakistan, and the whole world is misguided in believing that that's what it is. So I think that there Manto was on par with the feelings and sentiments of the majority of those from Kashmir and who are concerned about Kashmir, that this is not really India, Pakistan alone. This is about the people of Kashmir. You need to sort of understand their situation, and they are being sort of mauled by these two nation states. So I think in that context, his letter to Nehru was precisely this. I mean, he first of all said that my word Manto comes from the Kashmiri word month, which means 1.5 ser, which equals 3 pounds. And then he says, I'm a 1-2 man, which makes 3. So he's playing with that. But he says to Nehru that, your name is from being near a Neher, that's where you come from. So you're a Kashmiri, I am a Kashmiri, and I'm surprised that we are expecting Dr. Graham to solve our problems. I mean, this is the reference to the UN mediator at the time. And he says, why can't we solve this problem? You love Kashmir, I love Kashmir. I'm sure if Mahjoor had been alive, we wouldn't have had to do this. So there is this serious, non-serious nature, almost sort of, prodding Nehru to do something as a Kashmiri rather than as an Indian. So I think there is very much that play throughout his work, where he feels that this matter should be responded to in a different way than India and Pakistan are doing. I've referred to his short pieces, but I have to admit, when he was doing Nigarish, and he would write short pieces. I've tried my best to locate them. They kind of got, I haven't been able to locate all his writings on Kashmir, but the ones that I think he has some pieces that appear even in his mention of Kashmir, and one of my favorite works by him are the letters to Uncle Sam. Uncle Sam, usme, he has quite a bit that comes in a mischievous way about how the US is benefiting from India-Pakistan tensions and how they might benefit even more. So I think that he's a very has a very interesting approach, but I don't think that there's any question about his deep affinity to the valley, or to Kashmir, and Kashmiris, because he was brought up as a Kashmiri, albeit in Punjab. But to this day, I think it's fair to say that there's historic linkages between Punjab and Kashmir on which I can further elaborate, which go back a long time. Lahore is frequently described as a Kashmiri city because the Kashmiris run Punjab, or have done so until quite recently. I think they still are very powerful politically. Yes. I think that's all I want to say, and I will take questions. Is that sort of, unless you want me to add further, but I think that's what I wanted to mention about Manto and his associate.
So thank you for that, Professor. So I'll move to the Q&A right now. Now, the first question that I've received, you've already answered that, because that was specifically on how Manto saw his own identity, because he was not born in Kashmir and he was living outside Kashmir. But you already
I might add to that to this day, Kashmiris who live in Punjab identify as Kashmiris first. And, even though they've lived in Punjab all their lives, I think there's a lot of pride in belonging to a Kashmiri clan. The Kashmiris pride themselves in their food. So I think that all these facets perhaps are not understood as well in the valley, but there's those who keep coming and going know the feeling, but I think there's a genuine sort of love and affection for Kashmir and Kashmiris amongst those who live in what is now Punjab. Yes,
indeed. So the next question that I had, which we didn't touch upon yet, is I'll just read out the question here. What does Manto think of Indian and Pakistani nationalism? Is there any space for Kashmiris in this? How does he see nationalism on religious lines in the subcontinent?
He had a very poor opinion of it. He's written a series of pieces, fictional and non-fictional, where he seems to sort of really look down upon politics and leadership, that leadership almost needs to sort of mislead people on religious grounds for political mileage. And I think that for somebody who was not really a political thinker and much more of a social thinker, I think that was an observation that he constantly repeated and condemned those who used religion for political advantage.
Right. And so where can one place Manto then within the political spectrum? Because he was swept up by the anti-colonial struggle like all young men and women of his age, but he did call out hypocrisy of all forms, especially, as you pointed out, of great leaders and reformers. But he is definitely not a political activist. And in one piece, he says that he has as much interest in politics as Gandhi has in cinema. So where does one place Manto?
Manto is, as I said, a social critic, a social observer. He is somebody who thought out of the box. He wasn't somebody who could be fitted into categories. I think one of his very revealing pieces is where he talks about towards the time of partition, when the situation sort of really erupts into Hindu-Muslim differences, where he says that, when we travel in Bombay, when we are passing through a Hindu neighborhood, we wear a Gandhi cap, and when we go to a Muslim neighborhood, we don a Jinnah cap. So long live caps. So I mean, religion is now sort of in caps. So I think that pretty much encapsulates what his view was. I mean, he saw it as false. He couldn't understand why the subcontinent was being torn apart on religious lines when it was actually a political dispute, a matter of political accommodation. So I do think that on Kashmir, while, I mean, he sees it primarily because that's the way it got framed. And he wasn't a political analyst enough to sort of try and disassociate Kashmir from the Indo-Pakistan paradigm. Because, I mean, as I just said, the India-Pakistan, when you try to see Kashmir from their point of view, it's a real estate dispute. The people are just left out. I mean, and that is why people say that, India is performing what this Sari Hanifi used in the Palestinian case, a kind of spatiocide. They're not interested in people. They don't want to kill people necessarily, but they want the space. So it's actually it's not genocide. Genocide means, you're killing people, and they are killing people, but genocide would be a much bigger kind. So spatiocide, where they're perpetrating violence on the space that is Kashmir. Yeah. So I think there he would agree that this is something that doesn't leave much room for the Kashmiris. But I would say that in his own perceptions of what he wrote, he didn't question that. It was basically an India-Pakistan dispute. And I mean, he does write this letter, facetious letter to Nehru, saying that, we are Kashmiris, so why can't we solve this problem? Right. But so I think that is pretty much his view on the Indo-Pakistan factor. He doesn't understand, and he says it repeatedly, that while he doesn't understand or subscribe to this kind of, he subscribes to anti-colonialism, as you will know from his piece, The New Constitution, Naya Qanun, about the Tongewala. I think that's one of the strongest sort of anti-colonial, and there are others as well, but that one is. But he doesn't sort of understand why India and Pakistan are really at war. But once he moves to Pakistan, he says that while he never really understood why partition occurred, he was very distraught about it, he had come to accept it. I think that's the important thing, that while he may not have been an active supporter, he did come to reconcile himself to what had happened, with great difficulty, of course, but he did.
Right. In fact, the next question is connected to this. So the question is that Manto was a chronicler of human tragedy during partition, and he brought out how different human beings were what they were going through, and how their minds were mutating in the process. In stories like Thanda Ghosh, The Tale of 1947, he depicts the grim reality of human suffering. But do you see any lessons that present-day India and Pakistan can learn from Manto on how they approach religion, especially now in India, where Muslims are being hounded and hunted? For example, just 2 months ago in Delhi, over 50 Muslims had been killed. Over the last few years, since 2014, beef lynchings in the name of consumption of beef, they have just gone up across India. It's not located, isolated in some specific area. It's all over the country. And Muslims right now, during a time of COVID, being blamed for spreading the virus. And this is irrespective of whether these Muslims are actually adherent believers of the faith or not. So just having a beard or a Muslim name is sufficient to be killed or beaten up. And this reminds me of Manto saying, "Itna to Musalman hu ki mara ja sakta hu." So what are the lessons that present day India and Pakistan can learn from Manto and how they're approaching religion?
You've got to be willing to learn. As I said, Manto is for those who are prepared to think out of the box. Those who are lazy and are more comfortable siding with the powers that be will never like Manto, and they shouldn't even bother reading him. So I think it's a question of who you are. Obviously Manto has, he just thinks that this is all farcical, made up. And you can't, these are sort of just ploys by people to put, people against each other so that they can get political mileage out of it. So I think that he's extremely relevant. And I think that the reason why there has been a resurgence of interest in Manto is precisely this, that a lot of young people in particular have come to see through this nationalism, so-called, that they're being, or the national idioms in which they are, that they're supposed to sort of imbibe and follow. So they see through the hypocrisy. I mean, I have a lot of students from South Asia. I teach them, and they can see that these sorts of differences are more a construct than an actual practical reality. So I mean, we tend to, I mean, this war between India and Pakistan over Kashmir is more discursive. It's at a discursive level, but at a practical level, I see Pakistanis, those from Pakistan and from India, getting on perfectly all right until they get to discuss politics. So I do think that this is what that Manto is extremely useful. But I will sort of say that he isn't for everybody. You've got to be a bold thinker, and it's those people who are feeling the false narratives that they are being made to imbibe, who are attracted to the kind of mind that Manto is. He forces you to reject categories. He refused to be categorized. And here I'd like to mention that, you know, one of his disputes with the so-called progressive writers was precisely this. I mean, while he was a progressive writer, capital with a lower case p, he refused to become a member of the progressive writers group, because there it meant being ideologically bracketed as a communist and taking orders from the Kremlin. I mean, this is what he refused to be. I mean, he couldn't understand why he had to sort of take orders and be an ideologue. And for that, he was ostracized by some famous names who I will not mention. So I think there the left have shown to be extremely. I mean they're extremely sort of cliquish.
I think in the context of Kashmir, as Kashmiris, the left has, especially in India, the left has always let us down. In fact, in
everybody
India,
has left the Kashmiris down, as far as I'm concerned. And the question is, what can we do to sort of now stop depending on others? I mean, I think that's the question. I think everybody has left Kashmir.
Yes. In fact, right now is the time for Kashmiris to understand that we should not expect someone else to do something for us. We have to do it for ourselves.
So I think where he is relevant is precisely the way he thinks. I think this is the kind of thinking that I would encourage. I don't say that it is the kind of thinking for everybody, but for that particular kind of individual who doesn't fit, Manto is the person for that.
Right. So the next question I've gotten over here is that what was Manto's, speaking of how Manto thinks, what was Manto's intellectual development like? Because in his Bombay, in his Amritsar, in his Lahore, there live real people testing the limits of humanity, dignity, endurance, snatching whatever little happiness they can. So where does Manto get this extraordinary insight into human lives and human behavior? And if I may just add over here that I came across some writing by Manto where he's created two characters. One is Sadat Hasan and one is Manto, where he says that one of them is supposed to be an intellectual, but he's really not. So has he read Chekhov? Has he read, what is
it's a very good question, because I think people don't realize that Manto did not just emerge from nowhere. He was a notoriously bad student, deliberately, because he was a rebel. His father wanted him to sort of do the sciences, and he didn't, and he kept flunking, and then he eventually
actually flunked Urdu, because that's
he actually flunked Urdu, and then I think that he does sort of have a transformation, and he does it primarily through translations. I mean, there are two famous sets of translations he does. First of French, and he's greatly influenced by Maupassant. So he translates from, and how is he translating? He's translating French translated into English into Urdu. So that's one. So he learns the art of story writing, storytelling, observation through the likes of Maupassant. That's the French, and then he does a translation of Russian literature for this magazine called Humayun. So they are published in these, and so I think he really grows through this process as I mean, out of school, more in terms of his friends and his mentors. He actually, I mean, and one of his first translations is of you know, the now I'm forgetting it. It's the famous sort of case. What is it? Victor Hugo's case about and so he takes a stand on capital punishment. You know, so that's one of the first translations he does on the side. So what I'm trying to get at is that Manto really developed himself through translation, and the more I'm doing my own research, it seems that has been quite sort of common amongst several people. I mean, whether it's Deputy Nazir Ahmad, whether it's Maulvi Zukaullah, all these characters did a lot of translation, and it seems that was an educational process. We now see a translation as tedious, but clearly these people got a lot out of translating, because translation really involves a very close relationship with the text, and you really need to be able to understand in order to translate. So I think that, I would say, played a huge role. You know, and so I think that it's that process that made him what he is through literature. His mind was opened by literature. Chekhov, all these characters he read.
In your book, you have mentioned that Manto found it odd that Pakistan and India were fighting over Kashmir, something that you touched upon earlier when you were talking, that he found it odd that they were fighting over Kashmir and the United Nations was trying to mediate. And from his letters to Uncle Sam, Manto could understand the centrality of a conflict between India and Pakistan for the larger US game against the Soviet Union. And there's a passage from your book that the gains of the Korean War will be nothing in comparison with what the US can gain from a war if they instigate a war between India and Pakistan, because they will put in rush orders for American arms, giving a much needed boost to US economy, and in the process putting the subcontinent on the road to perdition. So can you shed some light on how Manto saw the Kashmir conflict being used in foreign policy of India, USA, Pakistan to further the objectives of the leaders of these nations?
I mean, he just saw this again. I mean, it was consistent with his view on politics, that these are just meant to mislead rather than guide people to. So he thought that America saw advantages in war. The American military-industrial complex. I mean, if you read his letters to Uncle Sam, where he's demanding a tiny atom bomb, he says, "Then you give me I'm a Muslim, so you give me a tiny atom bomb. You can give Nehru whatever you want in terms of military equipment, but you must give me an atom bomb because I'm a Muslim." So I think that I think it's that. I think it says it all for him. I'm sorry, I just got my things opening up. Hold on. You know, as far as he's concerned, he has a very skeptical view of the United States of America, and I think he does an excellent job of exposing what he regards as geopolitics. But I think the one piece that I was looking for the name, and it's basically a story that he writes about the UN Security Council being in session. I have it in the book, you know, both USA and USSR have launched their missiles at each other, and the Security Council is desperately trying to prevent a major conflagration, and so they eventually agree to redirect the missiles which have already been launched somewhere else. And the unfortunate part of the world is South Asia, where they're coming. So I think that he pretty much encapsulated everything, and he saw South Asia becoming a sort of victim of American policy or the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States of America. So I think that's how he saw it. And the Kashmiris, of course, are then a product of India-Pakistan dispute. So I think that's how he sees it.
Yes. So finally, this is just one question from my side, because the last 1 month, our members, we've been reading various stories of Manto, looking up literature, reading articles about him, some published in The Guardian, some in Pakistan in The Dawn, other newspapers. So some of us were wondering, so for someone who's starting on a journey of understanding Manto, where does one start from? So we read Titwal Ka Kutta, we read Toba Tek Singh, a few other short stories, some which were as short as one paragraph, like Galti, mistake, sorry, mistake.
Those are partition, those are Siyah Hashir, yes.
Yes. So where does one start with Manto?
I mean, I think there's a great misconception about Manto being just a short story writer. As a historian, I can tell you that I've been far more enlightened as to his way of thinking through his essays. So I would strongly encourage, while I love his short stories, I think there are types of short stories that he's written. I mean, you know, there's the Naya Kanun type, which are quite anti-colonial. And then there's the Oder, Boo, and you know, some of the others that, I mean, Thanda Gosht, Sakina. So I mean, I think, but his essays are extremely enlightening. So I would really strongly encourage people who are truly interested in understanding Manto to look at his essays, some of which have been translated in recent compilations. And so I think people are beginning to realize that Manto is not just a short story writer. He's also a very, very capable essayist, and therefore a real help. I mean, he's also a commentator. He's a witness to the age. I mean, he comments on what's going on around him. The questions, I mean, he's one of the first to sort of ask questions like, you know, what kind of cinema is Pakistan going to produce now that it's a Muslim, I mean, it is a separate country? Are they going to have only Muslim characters? Can they show Hindu characters? So I do think that, you know, he is able to do all that. Rather than just write short stories. He's very much I mean, and of course, I mean, you know, partition was tragic. It uprooted him, but he also wrote his best literature after he moved to Pakistan.
Yes.
But I think it's you know, the situation that Kashmiris faced at the time of partition was shared by many people. I mean, everybody found themselves. So I think that's what it displays. I mean, it could be Manto himself. I mean, you can read anything you want in that. But that particular character is just not happy fitting into either box. It just doesn't fit. I mean, so I think it's the out of the box situation that I think that's what Manto himself identifies with.
Yes. So there's one question on Pakistan, that after Manto went to Pakistan, there was a lot of censorship on him, and he's written about hypocrisy, intolerance, the cases of obscenity on him. So how is Manto disillusioned with the idea of Pakistan? Because you mentioned in your talk earlier that he accepted partition, he criticizes it, but is he disillusioned with the idea of these two nations? What is he trying to say when he is giving this criticism?
I mean, he famously says that the tragedy is not that there are two countries now, but the tragedy is that both countries are still victims of human bestiality, bigotry, hatred. That's what, like, we are still, I mean, you know, after we become independent, what are we going to, what do we have to fight for? But what the tragedy, he says, that we're not really independent, we're still sort of prisoners of these tendencies of human bestiality, of wanting to dominate and exploit people. That, he thinks, is the real tragedy. The pity of partition was not that India was partitioned, but that both countries remain sort of prone to savage sentiments and behavior. That's what he felt. So as far as disillusionment with Pakistan is concerned, I'd like to just point out that Manto repeatedly used to say that on the one hand, he is designated as one of the best Urdu short story writers by Pakistan and claimed. And on the other hand, he frequently gets messages from the government saying that he should vacate his house because he's a non-essential person. So I think he feels that he hasn't really been given the kind of status that they claim for him, because first of all, there was no film industry. He'd been doing rather well in the Bombay film industry, and he leaves all that to come to Pakistan, and there is no film industry there where he can make a living. And I mean, the few films that he tries his hand at are a failure. I mean, he writes the short stories. I mean the film scripts for, they don't work. So I think the sense of rejection by the so-called progressive writers on the one hand, which means that he can't really publish his pieces in those journals written by, owned by progressive writers, and the government on the other hand sees him as a rebel. So he belongs to neither. And it's that sense of not really belonging that eventually drives him to excessive drinking. I've said this in the book as well, that he was a heavy drinker. He becomes an alcoholic in Pakistan, largely because of the lack of opportunity that he has for his multiple talents.
Right. So then, and this question is connected to it, that did Pakistan give him the kind of life he had envisaged, which you're saying that he clearly didn't have that kind of life.
No,
So
he
the
didn't. I
question,
mean, he was always short of money. It was a hard life. So I don't think. I mean, I think he felt that he was not adequately acknowledged for
right?
his talents. And he thought very highly of his talents, by the way.
So when Manto was defending, he was speaking against the idea of partition, and at the same time, he was getting threats that he would be killed had he stayed back in India. Wasn't he, in a sense, defending an idea that would get him killed then? Had he stayed back, he would get killed, but he was still defending.
It's all consistent with his view that these people had been misled and that they were on the wrong track. And because they had been misled by the leadership and because things had taken this particular direction, he himself had become. I mean, he tells the famous story of the laundryman. I mean, the hobby. Who on a one drunken night when he goes to get his clothes, or I mean he sees this guy who wants to almost kill him, and he's the guy who very humbly comes and collects his laundry on a regular basis. So I mean, that's what I mean. I think the most telling of them is his exchange with Sham after they hear the story of these Sikhs who have had to sort of vacate the Northwest frontier after horrific disturbances there, and Sikhs and Hindus are targeted. And when he's hearing this, and when they leave, he asks him, "So what did you think?" He said, "I could have killed you."
Yeah.
So he says, but he said, "At that point, not now. At that point, I could have killed you." So I mean, he says that. I mean, so I think there's a lot of that where he feels that people can become something that they are not really.
Yes.
But I do want to say one final point here is that Manto's entire view was that you cannot, I mean, even the worst character, I mean, Thanda Gosht, take Thanda Gosht. I mean, even that character he feels has some humanity. And he doesn't really, he's not judgmental on his characters. What he says is that they're being made to do these things because of circumstance. So I do think that that's an extraordinarily important issue. It reminds me a lot of this book, which I recommend, Robert Musil, A Man Without Qualities. And in that, there is a rapist, Moosberger. And I mean, Musil also very much like Manto sort of believes that, he's a rapist and he's committed a crime, but the fault is of society and not of this individual. And I think Manto was very much on that wavelength, because he also saw partition and the violence that accompanied it. It shook him to the core, but he wanted to understand what was driving people to do these monstrosities. And that was circumstantial. The circumstances had driven it, not because people were born evil.
Yes.
That even a good human being could, in a moment of madness, carry out killings.
Right. Indeed.
So I think there's a psychological aspect to him as well that needs to be understood. And he really understood human psyche quite well. He's a good observer of human beings and able to represent them as well.
Right. There's just one last question that we have over here. So Manto's writing, a lot of it in Kashmir, at least definitely at that time, would be seen as profane or obscene. So do you think Kashmiri society would have accepted a writer like Manto then or now?
I mean, look, I mean, let me sort of say one thing to you. I mean, he said it famously that मैं काले बोर्ड पे चौक से लिखता हूँ ताकि उसकी जो blackness becomes more evident. And his point was that you don't like what I write. I'm not I mean, he claimed that none of his characters were fictional. All of them were drawn from real life, even though he turned that into fiction, but the characters were not fictional. And his point was that, I write about things that are already happening in your society. You want to close your eyes because you're a hypocrite. You can do that. I'm not writing about, he said, society hai nangi.
It's not my writing that's obscene.
Exactly. I mean, I'm just observing. He's just a realist. He's not a fan. I mean, he doesn't write sort of romantic. He's not romantic. And if you don't like it, so yes, I mean, there are people who want to deny that there's prostitution in Kashmir, or that there are other ills in Kashmir, and you want to pretend you want to sort of whitewash it. Yes, I mean, don't read.
On prostitution also, I was looking up older records of this, because under the Maharaja had he would tax prostitution, and he would export prostitutes from Kashmir to different parts of the subcontinent. and he would earn about 10 to 15% of his revenue from that. So records have indicated that there were about 18,000 prostitutes, registered prostitutes in Kashmir at that time.
Absolutely.
So this right.
I mean, I can tell you that, you know, I know families who fled Kashmir during the famines of the late 19th century, largely because they were afraid that the Maharaja would pick up their girls and force them into prostitution, because there was poverty, there was famine. So yes, I do think that, I mean, so in that sense, to say that Manto would not have been accepted is really saying that people refuse to accept the reality of their own social conditions.
Yes.
And as I said, you know, you don't have to read him. I mean, people have been calling him all sorts of wrong names. He continues to live while many of those who were his strongest critics ceased to be read. So I think that is what makes Manto timely and relevant to all times. Some of his pieces are relevant to all times. It's a way of thinking.
Is there any reading that we can get of Manto's position on Kashmir, whether he wants it to, whether he sees it with India, whether he sees it with Pakistan, from that time?
No, I don't really have anything. I think he just wanted a resolution. And I think he didn't go beyond what was being debated at that stage. At that stage, it was all about a plebiscite. The UN was in action. I mean, he died long before the issue kind of died out at the international level. So I do think that Manto was writing on Kashmir largely from the prism of the UN discussions. Zafrullah, he talks about Zafrullah, what Zafrullah Khan was doing. So I don't think that he took the position of an independent Kashmir as we might, or that I did much later. But he just followed what the news, reports.
Okay.
I mean, I certainly haven't come across any kind of a testament on on Kashmir. He just felt that India and Pakistan should solve their problems because it was not really worth it.
I was trying to look even in his characters to see if he's making the character take a position on Kashmir, but I also couldn't find that. So I thought maybe it's my inability.
But I do think that if you read something like Yazid, I think Yazid has some very telling insights where he says that, if for those of you who don't know the story, it's really about this man who names his son, at a time when India, or rather it's really historically, actually, it's East Punjab government that stops the flow of waters into Pakistan, or threatens to, and the villagers are furious and they abuse India. And he says, why are you abusing India? I mean, it's your enemy. And if we could close the waters, we would too as well. So he goes home, his wife's given birth to a child, and he names the child Yazid. And the wife says, what's wrong with you? So he says, well, that it's just a name. I mean, that man stopped the waters. This one will let the waters flow. So I think that's basically what pretty much sums up Manto's view. And I think he would take a similar view on Kashmir. Even though he didn't sort of quite say leave Kashmiris alone, which is what we are saying, because India and Pakistan have made such a royal mess of it. But the fact is that he saw it through the prism. I mean, that's at least my findings. I can't, put words into his mouth.
Yes. Thank you so much for this discussion. It's been lovely, absolutely lovely.
Okay, good, excellent. Maybe I'll join one of your discussions on Kashmir later, because I have lots to say about Kashmir.
You've been so kind to accept our invite, and you've been very, very generous.
Kashmir, which are very dear to my heart, as I said to you. But Kashmir is dear to my heart as well. So we will talk about maybe some other time, something else.
Definitely, inshallah.